Hey guys, tonight we wander barefoot into the muddy riverbanks of ancient Egypt, where your alarm clock is not a gentle phone notification, but a screaming ibis bird, and the growing certainty that if you do not get out of bed immediately, somebody important will yell at you before sunrise. The air already feels warm, even in the dim blue light before dawn, and the Nile nearby breathes mist across the fields like a giant sleepy serpent. Somewhere in the darkness, a donkey complains about existence with impressive emotional honesty. You, meanwhile, are about to begin another glorious day as a peasant farmer, which means lifting heavy things, sweating continuously, and hoping no crocodile develops a personal interest in your afternoon commute. Ancient Egypt sounds majestic in documentaries, but statistically speaking, you probably would not survive this experience very comfortably. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and while you're down there, comment your location and local time. I always love seeing where in the world people are listening from as we collectively drift off through history together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake on a woven reed mat inside a small mud brick house that still holds yesterday's heat like an oven somebody forgot to turn off. The walls smell faintly of clay, smoke, sweat, and grain dust. Your entire family sleeps in basically the same room because privacy has not yet been invented for ordinary people. A goat outside sneezes loudly enough to sound offended by the sunrise itself. The first thing you notice is your back hurting. The second thing you notice is that your back always hurts. Ancient Egyptian peasants spend most of their lives bent over fields, carrying water jars, grinding grain, hauling mud brick, or dragging baskets heavy enough to make your modern chiropractor quietly purchase a vacation home. Historians estimate that peasant labour formed the foundation of Egypt's entire economy for thousands of years. Pharaohs received the statues naturally, but peasants are the reason the statues exist at all. You sit up slowly while your joints crack like snapping reeds. Nearby, your mother is already awake, grinding grain between heavy stones. The repetitive crunching fills the room with a steady rhythm that somehow sounds both comforting and deeply exhausting. Grain dust floats through shafts of early sunlight sneaking past the doorway. Breakfast is simple because breakfast is always simple. Bread, maybe onions, weak beer if the brewing turned out well, and yes, beer counts as breakfast now. Egyptians drink enormous amounts of beer, partly because fermentation makes water safer, and partly because if you spent 14 hours under the Egyptian sun hauling mud around, you would probably invent breakfast beer too. Ancient workers were sometimes even paid in bread and beer rations. Imagine explaining to a modern accountant that your salary includes 6 loaves and 2 jugs of mildly sour liquid grain foam. Outside, the village slowly wakes beside the Nile. Mud brick homes crowd together unevenly, their flat roofs catching pale morning light. Dogs wander between houses searching for scraps. Children carry water jars nearly as large as their torsos, while old men squat beside walls discussing river levels with the seriousness of military strategists. Because honestly, the Nile controls everything. If the flood arrives properly, crops grow. If the flood fails, famine follows. If the flood rises too high, your fields vanish underwater and everybody spends months muttering nervously. Ancient Egyptian civilization survives because the Nile floods predictably enough to leave behind rich black soil. Herodotus, the Greek historian, famously called Egypt the gift of the Nile, which sounds poetic until you realize gifts from rivers occasionally include hippos capable of flattening a fishing boat. You step outside carrying a wooden hoe over your shoulder. The air smells damp and earthy. Thin fog curls above irrigation canals while distant birds circle low over the reeds. Somewhere farther downstream, priests in white linen probably greet the sunrise with sacred rituals. You greet the sunrise by wondering if your sandals will survive another week. Probably not. Your clothing is simple linen wrapped loosely around your waist because the Egyptian climate is brutally hot. Wealthy Egyptians wear cleaner, softer fabrics, sometimes even wigs scented with perfume cones that slowly melt during parties. You, however, smell like field labour and unfinished responsibilities. Still, life is not entirely miserable. That surprises many people. Peasant communities often work closely together, sharing labour, tools, food, and gossip. You know almost everyone in the village. You know who steals onions. You know whose donkey bites strangers. You know which neighbour insists he once saw a ghost emerging from the river during flood season after drinking approximately 9 gallons of beer. Historians still argue whether peasant life in Egypt was comparatively stable or simply less catastrophic than in neighbouring regions. Egypt does provide regular harvests more reliably than many ancient civilizations, but that does not mean your daily routine feels luxurious. It simply means starvation is slightly less frequent than elsewhere, which is not exactly the glowing tourism slogan ancient Egypt might prefer. You begin walking toward the fields with other villagers. The rising sun turns the Nile golden, while palm trees sway gently in the warm breeze. At moments like this, Egypt almost feels peaceful enough to forget how physically demanding your existence is. Almost. The fields spread wide beside the riverbanks, dark and fertile after the annual inundation. Workers move slowly across the land, carrying baskets, wooden tools and bundles of seed. There are no tractors, no steel ploughs, and definitely no convenient energy drinks. Farming depends almost entirely on muscle, timing, and endurance. A foreman shouts instructions nearby. Immediately, everyone suddenly becomes extremely interested in looking busy. You join the others, pressing seeds into moist soil with your bare feet. Mud squeezes between your toes while insects buzz endlessly around your face. Sweat forms almost instantly beneath the strengthening sun. The strange thing is that this rhythm has repeated for generations. Your father worked these fields. His father worked them too. Most likely your children will continue doing the same long after you're gone. Ancient Egypt changes slowly for ordinary people. Dynasties rise and collapse far away. Pharaohs build giant monuments. Priests debate theology. But here beside the Nile, the daily pattern remains stubbornly familiar. Wake, work, eat, sleep. Try not to get eaten by crocodiles in between. Oddly enough, Egyptians sometimes keep small household gods near their homes for protection against dangers exactly like this. Tiny statues of dwarf-like deities such as Bez are believed to guard families from evil spirits, illness, and possibly whatever horrifying noise your neighbour's goat keeps making before dawn. The morning sun climbs higher now, burning away the last cool traces of night. Your shoulders ache already, and the real labour has barely begun. Ancient Egypt, glorious land of pyramids and golden treasures, turns out to smell mostly like mud, sweat, wet reeds, and bread ovens. And honestly, you're going to smell exactly the same by lunchtime. The sun rises fast in Egypt, and by the time you've been working an hour, the cool morning air already feels like a distant rumour somebody invented to make labourers emotionally unstable. Sweat runs down your neck while the mud beneath your feet grows warm and sticky. Every movement pulls against the heavy river soil, rich and black from the Nile's yearly flood. This is the entire reason Egypt exists. Without the Nile, this landscape would mostly become dry desert stretching endlessly beneath a merciless sky. But every year the river swells from rains far to the south, flooding the banks and leaving behind fertile silt, dark enough to look almost black in morning light. Ancient Egyptians even called their land Kemet, meaning the black land, because those muddy fields mean survival. You stab your wooden hoe into the soil again, and again, and again. Nobody in ancient Egypt is counting steps yet, but if they were, peasants would probably set records entirely powered by desperation and onions. The flood season, known as Akhet, shapes your entire calendar. During inundation, much of the farmland disappears beneath water. Villages become little islands surrounded by slow-moving brown currents, while boats drift between palm trees and storage buildings. Then comes Pere, the growing season, when the floodwaters retreat and everyone rushes into the fields to plant before the soil dries too much beneath the sun. Finally comes Shimu, harvest season, which is essentially ancient Egypt's version of crunch time, except instead of answering emails you're trying to cut grain before heat, insects, birds, or government tax collectors take all of it first. You bend lower, pressing seeds carefully into the mud alongside dozens of other workers. The village moves almost as one living creature. Children carry baskets, women scatter grain. Men guide ploughs pulled by oxen broad enough to look personally offended by existence. one ox suddenly relieves itself directly beside you. Ancient history always leaves out details like this. The smell rolls through the field with horrifying confidence while nearby workers barely react. After all, this is normal life. Your sandals are already covered in mud anyway. Dignity abandoned this place shortly after sunrise. In the distance, narrow irrigation canals spread across the farmland like veins. Egyptian farmers developed surprisingly sophisticated irrigation systems, using basins, dikes, and channels to guide floodwater where it is needed most. Historians often point to this organisation as one reason Egypt becomes so powerful for so long. Controlling water means controlling food, and controlling food means controlling people. You personally control absolutely nothing. A bird steals seeds from a nearby basket, while a farmer curses with impressive creativity. The Nile itself glitters nearby beneath the strengthening sunlight, beautiful from a distance, slightly terrifying up close. Crocodiles drift silently near riverbanks, and hippos sometimes emerge from reeds like gigantic angry submarines. Ancient Egyptians genuinely fear hippos despite the cute modern image they somehow acquire thousands of years later. Male hippos can destroy boats, trample crops, and kill people with horrifying efficiency, which makes it particularly strange that some Egyptians also worship a hippopotamus goddess named Taweret, protector of childbirth and mothers. Ancient religion contains many moments where the official message seems to be yes, nature may absolutely kill you, but perhaps if you pray politely enough it will not. You pause briefly to drink water stored in a clay jar wrapped with damp cloth. The water tastes earthy and slightly warm already. Nearby workers drink weak beer from shared containers because hydration in ancient Egypt comes with accidental fermentation. The conversation around you drifts lazily through gossip and complaints. Someone says a nearby village lost part of its harvest after unexpected river currents damaged the canals. Another claims officials from the regional temple are demanding larger grain contributions this year. Somebody else swears a fisherman caught a catfish so enormous it nearly dragged him into the Nile. Nobody believes him, mostly because last month the same man claimed he saw a ghostly cow walking across the floodplain at midnight. Still, strange stories thrive beside the Nile. Some Egyptians believe certain animals carry divine meaning. Cats are admired for protecting grain stores from rodents. Ibises become associated with Thoth, god of wisdom. Crocodiles in some regions are even treated with sacred respect under the cult of Sobek. Certain temple crocodiles reportedly receive jewellery, fine food, and ceremonial treatment. Meanwhile, you're standing ankle-deep in mud trying not to get heatstroke before noon. Life feels unfair sometimes. Historians still argue whether Egyptian peasants enjoyed periods of relative comfort during strong harvest years, or whether survival remained constantly precarious beneath elite control. Evidence suggests some communities had decent access to food and stable housing, compared to many ancient societies, but stability does not equal ease. Your muscles still ache. Your skin still burns beneath the sun, and the state still expects taxes regardless of whether your crops succeed. A breeze finally moves across the fields carrying the smell of wet reeds and river water. Workers straighten their backs briefly, grateful for even a few seconds of relief. Far away beyond the farms and villages, giant monuments rise faintly against the horizon. Stone temples, royal tombs, massive structures built for kings, who probably never touch mud with their own feet. Ancient Egypt's wealth depends entirely on labour like yours. Farmers produce the grain feeding workers, priests, scribes, soldiers, and nobles. During flood seasons, when fields become temporarily unusable, peasants are often redirected towards state labour projects instead. Contrary to old myths, many pyramid builders are not enslaved foreigners whipped endlessly beneath the desert sun. Archaeological evidence suggests large numbers are actually Egyptian labourers working in organised crews, sometimes fed surprisingly well. Of course, surprisingly well in ancient terms still means a diet heavily involving bread and beer. You glance toward the sky. The sun now hangs brutally overhead. Heat shimmers above the fields while insects buzz in endless clouds. Linen sticks against your skin. Your shoulders burn. A nearby farmer suddenly yelps and jumps backward. Everyone freezes. Snake. For one terrible second, nobody moves. The small cobra slides silently through the mud between rows of crops before disappearing into reeds near the canal. Conversations resume almost immediately afterward because this happens often enough that panic becomes impractical. Ancient Egypt contains an impressive variety of things eager to bite, sting, infect, crush, or poison you, and modern people wonder why ancient medicine becomes so creative. Some remedies genuinely work. Others involve magical spells, animal fat, or ingredients that sound less like medicine and more like somebody lost an argument with a pantry shelf. One ancient text even recommends using crocodile dung in certain treatments. Historians are divided on whether this was symbolic, medicinal, or simply evidence that absolutely nobody was having a normal time in the Bronze Age. The work continues through afternoon. Planting, digging, sweating. The rhythm almost becomes hypnotic beneath the drone of insects and distant bird calls. Your feet sink deeper into warm mud, while the Nile glimmers endlessly beside the fields like a living heartbeat. This river gives life. This river also decides whether you eat next year, and every peasant beside you understands that truth with exhausting clarity. By late afternoon, your arms feel heavy as stone. The foreman finally calls for rest, and the entire field seems to exhale together. Workers gather tools while oxen snort impatiently in the heat. Somewhere nearby, someone starts laughing at a joke too tired to fully explain. The sun slowly lowers toward the western desert now, turning the Nile bronze beneath drifting clouds of insects, and tomorrow morning, before dawn even fully arrives, you will wake up and do all of this all over again. By the time harvest season arrives, the fields no longer smell fresh and damp. Now the air tastes dry, dusty and sharp with cut grain. Every stalk of emmer wheat and barley matters, because this is the moment the entire year has been building toward. If the harvest goes badly, life becomes uncomfortable very quickly. If it goes very badly, people start looking at storage jars with the emotional intensity of treasure hunters. You stand knee-deep in brittle stalks beneath the hot Egyptian sun, cutting grain with a curved sickle fitted with tiny flint blades. The work is repetitive enough to make your thoughts blur together. Slice, gather, tie. Repeat until your shoulders stop cooperating with your ambitions. Nearby, workers move through the fields in long rows while children collect fallen stalks from the dirt. Nothing is wasted. Grain is survival. Grain is taxes. Grain is political stability. Grain is basically the reason pharaohs can afford giant statues of themselves looking dramatically into the distance. And unfortunately for you, grain is also about to become paperwork, or at least the ancient Egyptian version of paperwork. The scribes arrive shortly after midday. You spot them immediately because scribes look completely different from farmers. Their linen is cleaner, their hands are softer. Their posture suggests they have not spent the morning wrestling irrigation mud while swatting insects from sensitive body parts. Honestly, it is difficult not to resent them a little. A pair of officials walk carefully along the edge of the fields carrying writing pallets and rolled papyrus. Behind them come guards and assistants prepared to measure grain deliveries. Ancient Egypt depends heavily on record keeping. The state tracks harvests, labour, taxes and supplies with astonishing detail for the ancient world. And every time a scribe dips his reed brush into ink, your anxiety increases slightly. Because taxes in ancient Egypt are often paid in grain. The amount depends on land quality, flood success, and local administration, but the important detail is this: the state always expects its share. Pharaohs need grain to feed priests, soldiers, administrators, labour crews, and royal households. Temples store enormous reserves. Bureaucracy spreads across Egypt like a giant papyrus-covered spiderweb. You personally contribute by sweating into wheat fields until your spine feels permanently bent. One scribe squints toward the harvest piles while muttering calculations to himself. Another records measurements with practiced efficiency. Historians often describe scribes as one of the most respected professions in Egypt because literacy remains rare and valuable. A famous Egyptian text called the Satire of the Trades even praises scribes by insulting literally every other occupation. It basically reads like an ancient advertisement saying, "Become a scribe, because farming destroys your body and fishermen occasionally get eaten by crocodiles." You cannot entirely argue with this assessment. A supervisor orders your group to carry grain baskets toward the measuring area. Dust rises around your ankles while the afternoon heat presses downward like a physical weight. Each basket feels heavier than the last. Nearby, an exhausted worker wipes sweat from his forehead and accidentally spills part of his load. The foreman notices immediately. That poor man is about to hear several opinions delivered at high volume. You dump your grain carefully into a larger pile, while scribes record quantities using a numbering system involving symbols for units, tens, hundreds, and thousands. Ancient Egyptian mathematics is surprisingly advanced in practical matters. They calculate land areas, taxes, and construction measurements with impressive skill, though fractions apparently exist mainly to emotionally challenge future students. The officials continue moving through the harvest with calm efficiency, while everyone else quietly panics about whether enough grain remains after taxation. Because your family still needs food. Bread forms the centre of nearly every meal in ancient Egypt. Different qualities exist depending on wealth, but ordinary peasants mostly eat coarse loaves packed with bits of grit from grinding stones. Archaeologists examining Egyptian skeletons often find severe dental wear partly caused by tiny stone particles mixed into flour, so even your bread is secretly trying to destroy your teeth. Comforting thought. Nearby, a donkey suddenly steals part of a grain sack and trots away with surprising speed for an animal shaped like an irritated chair. Several workers chase after it while shouting. Even one of the scribes laughs slightly before catching himself and returning to his serious professional expression. Moments like this break the tension. Because taxes make everyone nervous. Historians still argue whether Egyptian taxation systems were relatively efficient or brutally exploitative, depending on the dynasty and region. Some evidence suggests local administrators occasionally abused their authority, demanding more than officially required. Other records indicate communities sometimes negotiated obligations during difficult flood years. Ancient bureaucracy, it turns out, contains many of the same frustrations humans still complain about today. Too much paperwork, too many officials, and absolutely nobody enjoys audits. The sun slowly lowers while workers continue hauling harvested grain toward communal storage areas. Massive granaries stand near villages and temples, built carefully to protect food supplies from moisture and pests. Cats roam constantly nearby hunting rodents. Egyptian admiration for cats partly grows from this practical role. A good mouser protecting grain supplies becomes genuinely valuable. Of course, cats in Egypt eventually achieve a level of cultural respect most humans can only dream about. You, meanwhile, remain sweaty and covered in dust. A temple official passes nearby wearing clean white linen and a shaved head glistening in sunlight. Priests often shave body hair for ritual purity, which honestly sounds refreshing in this climate. He inspects the grain deliveries while assistants whisper numbers beside him. Religion and government overlap constantly in Egypt. Temples control land, labour, and enormous wealth. Gods are not distant concepts here. They influence harvests, floods, fertility, health, and political power. If crops fail, people do not just blame weather. They worry cosmic balance itself may be disturbed. The Egyptians call this balance ma'at, harmony, order, stability. You call it, hopefully enough grain survives taxation so nobody starves during winter. A worker beside you quietly complains that officials always measure generously when taking taxes and conservatively when distributing supplies later. Several nearby farmers nod instantly. Some things never change across human history. As evening approaches, the temperature finally softens slightly. Golden sunlight spreads across the harvested fields, while long shadows stretch toward the Nile. Workers begin carrying the last grain loads toward storage buildings. Your arms tremble from exhaustion now. Dust coats your skin. Your throat feels dry enough to store papyrus scrolls. Still, there is satisfaction in seeing full granaries after months of labour. A successful harvest means survival through another year. Families may even celebrate modestly tonight with extra beer, music, or storytelling beneath the stars. Ancient Egyptian music often includes drums, clappers, flutes, and string instruments. Farmers sing work songs during harvest too, partly for rhythm and partly because repetitive labour becomes slightly less miserable when everyone complains musically together. You start walking home beside the canal as dusk settles across the land. Frogs croak from reeds, while insects hum above the water. The Nile reflects deep orange sunlight like polished metal, Behind you, scribes finish recording harvest totals onto papyrus. Ahead of you waits a simple dinner, aching muscles, and a sleeping mat that somehow never becomes comfortable enough. But for tonight at least, the grain is gathered, and that means tomorrow's warriors can wait until sunrise. The Nile flood season changes everything. 1 month you are planting and harvesting beneath endless sunlight, and the next your fields disappear beneath broad sheets of brown water stretching across the floodplain. Villages rise like little islands above the inundation, while boats glide where cattle walked only weeks earlier. At first, the flood season almost feels restful. Almost. Because while farming pauses temporarily, the state suddenly remembers it has approximately 1,000 gigantic building projects requiring human backs immediately, which is how you end up standing beside a line of labourers staring at an enormous limestone block while reconsidering every life decision leading to this exact moment. Far to the north, rising above the desert plateau, massive royal monuments dominate the horizon. Temples, tombs, statues and pyramids announce the power of pharaohs with all the subtlety of a golden trumpet blast directly into your soul. Ancient Egyptian rulers build on a scale that still confuses modern people. And those structures require workers, lots of workers. Despite popular myths, historians now believe many large royal projects rely heavily on seasonal labour crews rather than endless masses of enslaved foreigners. Archaeological discoveries near pyramid complexes reveal organised worker villages complete with bakeries, breweries, storage rooms and even medical care. Skilled workers receive rations and housing, while labour teams develop names that sound surprisingly enthusiastic, like Friends of Khufu, which feels slightly optimistic when you're dragging rocks in 40-degree heat. You arrive at the labour camp before sunrise, carrying a bundle of bread and dried onions for the day. The desert air feels cool at first, but everyone knows that mercy will disappear soon enough. Hundreds of workers gather around supply stations while supervisors shout instructions over the noise of animals, tools, and grumbling humans. Dust already hangs thick in the air. The monument itself towers overhead in unfinished stages. Stone ramps rise at strange angles while teams haul blocks upward using sledges, ropes, wooden rollers, and collective determination bordering on spiritual crisis. Hammering echoes across the site. Men carry baskets of rubble. Others smooth limestone surfaces until they gleam pale beneath the sun. The sheer organisation feels overwhelming. Ancient Egypt develops one of the world's earliest large bureaucratic states, capable of coordinating labour, food supplies, transportation, and engineering across enormous distances. Grain from villages like yours feeds these projects. Scribes track workers and rations. Officials supervise crews. Boat captains transport stone along the Nile, and you mostly transport back pain. A foreman assigns your team to haul limestone blocks from a staging area toward an upward ramp. Several men pour water onto the sand ahead of the sledge because damp sand reduces friction. Modern experiments actually confirm this works surprisingly well. Ancient Egyptian engineering often appears deceptively simple, until you realise how effective it becomes through sheer coordination and experience. You grip the rope. The foreman shouts. Everyone leans backward together. The stone moves perhaps 2 inches. Excellent progress. By mid-morning your shoulders burn like someone replaced your muscles with hot pottery shards. Sweat drips constantly into your eyes. Nearby workers chant rhythmically while pulling ropes to keep movements synchronized. Heave, step, heave, step. One man trips and nearly gets flattened by the shifting sledge before others yank him aside at the last second. Nobody even pauses very long afterward because dangerous accidents happen constantly on projects this large. Broken bones, crushed limbs, dehydration, infections. Ancient construction sites contain endless opportunities for catastrophic personal growth. Still, there are moments of strange pride too. You glance upward toward completed sections of polished stone glowing beneath the sun. These monuments are meant to last forever. Pharaohs believe their tombs help secure eternal life among the gods. Priests conduct rituals. Architects plan alignments with stars and cardinal directions. Entire cosmic ideas become trapped inside stone architecture. Meanwhile, you are mostly trying not to faint before lunch. Workers finally gather beneath temporary shade awnings around midday. Bread, beer, garlic and onions circulate through the exhausted crowd. Garlic is especially valued because Egyptians believe it improves strength and endurance. Whether this is medically accurate or simply ancient motivational seasoning remains unclear. Either way, everyone smells incredible afterward. A nearby labourer claims he once saw the pharaoh himself travelling along the Nile aboard a golden royal barge surrounded by soldiers and musicians. Another insists royal guards wear enough jewellery to feed an entire village for years. Nobody can confirm either story. Most peasants never interact directly with pharaohs at all. The ruler exists more like a distant divine force, part king, part god, part administrative concept wearing expensive eyeliner. Official art always shows pharaohs youthful, powerful and victorious. Statues never depict rulers collapsing face first into mud after carrying limestone all day. An unfortunate lack of realism, honestly. Historians still argue whether pyramid labour was viewed as patriotic religious duty, economic necessity, or simply unavoidable state obligation. The truth probably varies depending on period, region, and who exactly is doing the hauling. Skilled craftsmen may hold respected positions, while temporary labourers likely focus more on surviving the work week without losing a foot. The afternoon heat becomes almost unbearable. Desert wind carries fine dust into your mouth and eyes. Sand sticks to sweat across your arms. Everywhere you look, workers strain beneath impossible-looking loads while overseers monitor progress carefully. Yet somehow the monument keeps rising, stone by stone, ramp by ramp, year after exhausting year. Nearby, skilled artisans carve hieroglyphs into limestone blocks with remarkable precision. Egyptian writing combines symbols representing sounds, ideas and objects into elaborate inscriptions praising kings and gods. Literacy remains limited mostly to scribes and elites, making written language itself feel almost magical. You personally identify symbols mainly by whether they indicate more work is approaching. At one point, a worker whispers about a curse protecting royal tombs from thieves. Another claims spirits wander unfinished chambers at night. Ancient Egypt overflows with supernatural stories because death feels constantly nearby here. Tombs are not merely graves. They are eternal houses for the soul. And judging by how much labour goes into them, apparently the afterlife requires extremely impressive real estate. Late afternoon sunlight turns the desert golden. The monument casts an enormous shadow across the labour camp, while workers slowly finish the day's assignments. Your hands ache from gripping ropes. Your legs feel unstable. Even breathing seems strangely tiring now. Still, the foreman appears satisfied, which means tomorrow will probably be equally terrible. As labourers begin returning toward camp shelters, musicians nearby tap simple rhythms on drums while workers laugh weakly through their exhaustion. Humans adapt quickly, even to absurd situations. Give people enough shared suffering and eventually somebody starts making jokes about it. You glance once more toward the unfinished structure towering against the evening sky. Thousands of years from now, people will stare at monuments like this and wonder how ancient Egyptians built them. The answer, unfortunately, is mostly with enormous amounts of tired peasants. And tomorrow morning, you will wake up sore enough to personally resent every single stone. By the end of a labour day in ancient Egypt, your stomach feels like a hollow clay jar somebody forgot to fill. The sun has drained every useful thought from your brain. Your shoulders ache from hauling stone or working fields, and all you want in life is food, shade, and perhaps the emotional strength not to scream at the next mosquito you see. Mostly food. Fortunately, ancient Egyptians take food very seriously. Unfortunately, you are still a peasant, which means dinner tonight, like most nights, revolves around bread and beer again. There are entire civilizations built on less reliable foundations, honestly. You return home through narrow village paths while cooking smoke drifts into the evening air. The smell of baking bread spreads between mud brick houses, mixing with river mud, animal dung, onions and the faint sweetness of date palms nearby. Children chase each other between storage jars while exhausted adults sit outside catching whatever breeze still survives after sunset. Inside your home, grain is already being prepared for tomorrow's bread. This process takes forever. Someone must grind wheat or barley using heavy grinding stones, knead dough by hand, shape loaves, and bake them in clay ovens hot enough to make your eyebrows reconsider their future. The grinding alone destroys shoulders over time. Archaeologists examining skeletons from ancient Egypt often find evidence of worn joints and damaged backs, caused by repetitive labour exactly like this. Everyday survival is physically expensive. Tonight's meal arrives on simple pottery dishes, coarse bread, onions, lentils, and weak beer cloudy enough to resemble suspicious soup. Maybe there are figs if the harvest has been generous. Maybe a little fish from the Nile if someone in the family traded successfully. Meat, however, is rare for ordinary people. Wealthy Egyptians feast on beef, goose, duck, and elaborate desserts sweetened with honey. You occasionally stare at rich people's banquets, the way modern humans stare at luxury vacation advertisements. Very inspirational, very unattainable. Bread itself comes in many forms across Egypt. Bakers shape loaves into rounds, cones, flat cakes, and strange decorative designs. Some are flavoured with dates or herbs. Others are dense enough to function as emergency construction materials. Egyptian beer also varies widely in quality. It is usually thick, mildly alcoholic, and sometimes full of floating grain bits. Basically, ancient beer occasionally asks you to chew it. You sit cross-legged near a small oil lamp while insects buzz around the room with supernatural persistence. Your younger relatives argue quietly nearby over who receives the larger piece of bread. An older family member tells everyone to stop complaining because during one poor flood season years ago, people survived mostly on onions and regret. Ancient Egyptian onions become surprisingly important. Workers eat them constantly. Builders receive onion rations. Some labourers even swear onions increase strength and endurance. Garlic too. Entire work crews march around smelling like heavily seasoned determination. Historians still argue whether Egyptian workers were genuinely healthier than many neighbouring populations due to relatively stable food supplies, or whether nutritional shortages remained common among poorer communities. The answer likely changes depending on flood cycles and political stability. Good years bring fuller granaries. Bad years bring hunger frighteningly fast. Tonight seems somewhere in the middle. You tear apart another chunk of bread while listening to village sounds drifting through the darkness outside. Donkeys bray. Someone nearby plays a flute softly. Laughter rises briefly from another house, where neighbours gather over beer jars after work. These evenings matter. Ancient peasant life is exhausting, but communal moments help soften it. Families share stories, gossip, songs, and complaints beneath the stars. Egypt's climate encourages outdoor social life after sunset, once the brutal daytime heat finally loosens its grip. A neighbour arrives carrying fresh dates as part of a small trade agreement involving fish hooks and a deeply confusing argument about goats from last month. Barter remains common in village life, even within Egypt's organised economy. People exchange food, labour, tools, cloth and favours constantly. Money exists in limited forms later on, but for now your economy mostly runs on grain and mutual obligation. And onions. Always onions. Your mother carefully stores leftover grain inside clay jars sealed against pests. Storage is critical because rodents, insects and moisture constantly threaten food supplies. Cats wander freely through many Egyptian homes, partly because they help protect grain stores from mice. Over time, cats gain extraordinary cultural status. Some temples even breed sacred cats connected to the goddess Bastet. Imagine becoming so respected for catching mice that future civilizations start worshipping your species, an incredible career trajectory. Outside, the night air cools slightly. You step onto the flat roof of the house carrying a beer jug while the Nile glimmers silver beneath moonlight. Many Egyptians sleep on rooftops during hotter months because indoor rooms trap heat horribly after sunset. The stars above Egypt look astonishingly bright without modern lights. Priests and astronomers track celestial movements carefully for religious calendars and agricultural timing. Certain stars even help predict the Nile flood. The heavens feel deeply connected to earthly survival. You mostly use the stars to wonder whether tomorrow's work might somehow get cancelled by divine intervention. Unlikely. A cousin nearby tells a story about wealthy nobles hosting banquets with dancers, perfumes, musicians, roasted duck, and sweet wine imported from distant regions. Another claims elite guests wear scented wax cones atop their wigs that slowly melt during parties, releasing perfume down their hair. You picture this for a moment while holding your gritty bread loaf. Human inequality really does have remarkable range. Still, peasants are not completely excluded from pleasure. Festivals sometimes provide communal feasts and extra beer. Fishing brings variety to meals. Gardens grow lettuce, beans, cucumbers and herbs. Dates and figs add sweetness when available. Compared to some ancient societies, Egyptian peasants may even enjoy relatively stable diets during prosperous eras. Though admittedly stable still includes accidental sand in your bread approximately every day. A warm breeze moves across the village carrying river smells through the darkness. Somewhere out on the Nile, fishermen continue working by torchlight, while frogs croak endlessly from the reeds. You finish the last of your beer slowly, feeling the exhaustion settle deep into your bones. Tomorrow morning begins again before sunrise. More labour, more dust, more bread. More endless conversations about flood levels. Yet there is comfort in rhythm too. The Nile rises, crops grow, bread bakes, families gather beneath evening stars. Ancient Egypt survives because millions of ordinary people repeat these routines generation after generation without monuments or glory. No golden mask waits for you after death. No giant statue bears your name, but your work feeds kingdoms. And tonight, beneath the warm Egyptian sky, that humble loaf of bread in your hands feels more important than any pyramid on the horizon. Night in ancient Egypt sounds surprisingly alive. You lie awake on a woven reed mat while the village murmurs softly around you. Dogs bark somewhere beyond the mud brick walls. Insects buzz with relentless commitment. A baby cries briefly in another house before somebody soothes it back to sleep. Outside near the riverbank, frogs perform what feels like a deeply unnecessary midnight concert. And directly above your head, something scratches in the ceiling reeds. Probably a rat. Excellent. Your house is small, rectangular, and built from sun-dried mud brick made of Nile clay mixed with straw. Most homes in peasant villages follow similar designs because mud brick is cheap, practical, and unfortunately very enthusiastic about trapping heat during the day. Wealthier Egyptians own larger homes with painted walls, servants, courtyards, and actual furniture. Your furniture consists mostly of baskets, jars, mats, and confidence. Still, the house matters deeply. It protects the family from sun, wind, insects, and whatever questionable creature just made that sound near the doorway. You roll onto your side carefully, because every muscle still aches from labour. The room smells faintly of smoke from the cooking fire, warm clay walls, stored grain, and human exhaustion. During cooler months, the smell becomes manageable. During hotter months, the air inside can feel thick enough to chew. Ancient Egyptians often cook indoors using clay ovens or open hearths, which means smoke stains walls and irritates lungs constantly. Historians studying ancient remains believe respiratory problems may have been common, especially among women spending long hours near cooking fires. Meanwhile, mosquitoes continue their military campaign against humanity. Each child sleeping nearby kicks suddenly and mutters nonsense before settling again. Entire families often sleep close together because space is limited. Privacy barely exists for peasants. You hear every cough, snore, argument, and suspicious stomach noise produced within a 10-foot radius. Romantic in theory. Less romantic after 6 consecutive hours of donkey noises. You sit up briefly to drink water from a clay jar kept cool through evaporation. The jar sweats slightly in the warm air. Nearby shelves hold simple possessions, pottery bowls, woven baskets, tools, spare linen clothing, and maybe a tiny household shrine tucked into the wall. Religion lives inside homes as much as temples here. Small statues of protective gods stand watch over families. Bes, the squat lion-faced household deity, appears especially popular. He looks less like a majestic divine being, and more like a tiny magical bouncer prepared to fight demons in a tavern alley. Which honestly makes him comforting. Families pray for health, fertility, protection, and safe childbirth, because daily life feels uncertain constantly. Illness spreads easily, injuries happen often, children sometimes die young. A fever that modern medicine solves in days may become terrifying in ancient Egypt. And the medical treatments available can become creative. Egyptian physicians actually possess surprisingly advanced knowledge in some areas. Medical papyri describe wound stitching, bone setting, and practical treatments for injuries. But medicine also mixes heavily with magic and ritual. One remedy for eye problems includes crushed pig's eye mixed with other ingredients. Another treatment involves chanting spells over bread. And yes, somebody somewhere absolutely suggested crocodile dung again. Historians still argue how much ordinary Egyptians truly believed magical cures worked, versus simply accepting them because alternatives were limited. Probably both. When your choices are strange ritual paste, or certain death, humans become remarkably open-minded. A warm desert wind drifts through the doorway carrying dust and faint river smells. Outside, moonlight washes across flat rooftops where some villagers sleep to escape the heat trapped indoors. During summer nights, rooftops become social spaces too. Neighbours gossip quietly beneath the stars while children fall asleep beside them. You climb carefully onto the roof yourself because the room below feels unbearable now. The mud brick beneath your feet still radiates leftover heat from the day. Across the village, scattered oil lamps flicker softly while the Nile gleams silver in the distance. For a moment, everything feels calm. Then a donkey screams somewhere nearby like a soul being dragged into the underworld. Ancient Egyptian nights really keep you emotionally alert. You settle onto another mat facing the open sky. Stars spread endlessly overhead, sharp and brilliant above the dark floodplain. Priests interpret celestial patterns carefully because astronomy connects deeply to religion and agriculture. Sirius, the bright star associated with the goddess Sopdet, becomes especially important because its appearance coincides closely with the Nile flood season. To priests, stars reveal cosmic order. To you, they mostly reveal how badly your back hurts. A neighbour whispers from the next rooftop asking whether your family has enough grain stored for next month. Food anxiety never fully disappears here. One poor harvest can ripple through entire villages. Egypt usually remains productive compared to many ancient regions, but nature still controls everything. Too little floodwater means drought, too much means destruction. The Nile gives life with one hand and threatens it with the other. Nearby, an older man begins telling children stories about spirits wandering desert tombs. Egyptian beliefs about the dead are deeply complex. Souls require proper burial, offerings, and remembrance to survive peacefully in the afterlife. Angry ghosts occasionally appear in stories if rituals are neglected, which feels slightly unfair. Imagine dying after decades of exhausting labour, only to receive additional paperwork in the spirit world. Still, people listen carefully because death never feels distant in ancient Egypt. Funerals pass regularly through villages. Disease spreads quickly. Dangerous animals lurk near riverbanks. Even simple infections can become fatal. Yet life continues stubbornly anyway. You notice movement near a rooftop edge. Cat. The animal slips silently through moonlight hunting mice between grain jars. Egyptians admire cats not only for pest control, but also for their strange calm confidence. Watching one move through darkness feels almost supernatural. A child nearby whispers that harming a cat brings terrible luck. Some ancient accounts even suggest families mourn dead cats deeply, sometimes shaving eyebrows as signs of grief. Meanwhile, human peasants receive approximately 3 days off before returning to work. Civilization has priorities. The night grows quieter now. Even the insects soften slightly. Somewhere across the Nile, temple drums echo faintly through the darkness during late rituals. Priests remain awake while much of the countryside sleeps. Tomorrow morning arrives soon. Before sunrise, grain must be ground again, water carried again, fields worked again, bread baked again. Ancient Egyptian life moves in endless cycles as steady as the river itself. You close your eyes slowly while warm wind brushes across the rooftop. Beneath the stars of ancient Egypt, surrounded by mud brick walls and sleeping families, your world feels both incredibly fragile and strangely eternal. And somewhere in the darkness below, that rat is probably still plotting against your grain storage. Morning arrives with temple music drifting faintly across the Nile. Not loud music, nothing dramatic. Just the distant pulse of drums and chanting carried over water, while the eastern sky slowly brightens from deep blue into dusty gold. You wake on the rooftop wrapped in a thin linen cloth, feeling briefly peaceful before remembering that you still live in ancient Egypt and therefore must immediately resume sweating for survival. A bird lands nearby and stares at you with unsettling confidence. In Egypt, Even the wildlife behaves like it owns property. You climb down into the house where your family is already awake. Someone lights the morning fire, someone else grinds grain with the weary determination of a person who has accepted this task will continue forever, possibly into the afterlife. Smoke curls through the room, while the smell of baking bread slowly fills the air. Before anyone eats, however, your mother pauses briefly beside the small household shrine built into the wall. A tiny clay figure of Bess stands there beside another small image of Taweret, the protective hippopotamus goddess. Someone has left flowers near them. A whispered prayer follows, short, quiet, routine. Protect the family, protect the children, protect the food stores, and if possible, maybe protect everyone from crocodiles, fevers, and tax collectors too. Religion in ancient Egypt does not stay locked inside giant temples. It flows through daily life constantly. Gods watch over childbirth, harvests, rivers, storms, sleep, sickness, and death. Every task feels connected to divine forces somehow. Even ordinary peasants like you live surrounded by rituals, charms, offerings, and prayers. Honestly, considering how dangerous daily life can be, you understand the appeal. You step outside carrying a small basket while dawn spreads across the village. The Nile glows softly beyond the reeds, and already people move toward fields, workshops, and boats. A woman nearby hangs protective amulets over her doorway, while muttering prayers under her breath. Amulets appear everywhere in Egypt. Tiny scarabs, protective eyes, miniature gods. People wear them around their necks, sew them into clothing, place them beside beds, or bury them with the dead. Egyptians believe symbols hold genuine spiritual power. The Eye of Horus, for example, represents healing and protection, after the god Horus loses and regains his eye in mythological battles. You personally would appreciate an amulet specifically designed to prevent foot blisters. No sign of that one yet. As you walk through the village, you pass a small roadside shrine covered with offerings. Bread, beer, flowers, maybe a little incense if someone can afford it. A farmer pauses briefly to touch the shrine before continuing toward the fields. Nobody finds this unusual. Religion and routine blend together completely here. The major gods loom large over Egypt's spiritual world. Ra sails across the sky as the sun god. Osiris rules the afterlife. Isis protects families and motherhood. Horus embodies kingship and divine order. But ordinary peasants often focus more on local deities and practical concerns. You pray for rain, safe childbirth, healthy livestock, a decent flood season, and ideally fewer insects in the grain storage. At the riverside, fishermen prepare boats beneath the rising sun. One man pours a small offering into the Nile before launching his net. The river itself feels sacred because it literally sustains civilization. Hapi, god of the Nile flood, receives prayers during inundation seasons because everyone understands the terrifying truth. If the flood fails badly enough, entire communities suffer. Historians still argue whether Egyptian religion primarily offered emotional comfort or functioned more as social and political control, reinforcing the authority of kings and priests. Most likely both. Faith explains the unpredictable world while also supporting the massive hierarchy keeping Egypt organized. An organized Egypt is very important if you enjoy eating. A priest passes nearby wearing spotless white linen and carrying incense. Priests maintain temple rituals believed necessary to preserve cosmic order, or Mahat. Without proper offerings and ceremonies, Egyptians fear chaos could overwhelm the world. Which sounds dramatic until you realize one failed Nile flood can genuinely create famine. So perhaps the priests are onto something. You continue toward a local temple complex smaller than the giant monuments farther north, but still impressive compared to village homes. Massive painted columns rise above the entrance, while carved reliefs show gods towering over tiny humans. Priests move carefully through shaded courtyards carrying food offerings and sacred objects. Ordinary peasants rarely access the innermost temple chambers. Those spaces belong mainly to priests and sacred statues. Temples function almost like divine households where gods receive meals, clothing, incense, music, and ritual attention daily. The gods, it seems, maintain significantly better living conditions than peasants. Still, festivals change everything. During religious celebrations, temple statues sometimes travel through towns on ceremonial boats or platforms, while crowds gather singing, dancing, and drinking enormous quantities of beer. Festivals provide rare moments when ordinary people interact directly with sacred images, and honestly, also rare moments when everyone becomes extremely drunk together. A worker nearby once swore he saw a priest fall into a canal during a festival procession after accidentally consuming too much ceremonial beer. The official temple version of events apparently differs slightly. You help carry baskets toward the temple storehouses where grain offerings are collected. Temples own vast lands throughout Egypt and employ enormous labour forces. Some scholars compare them to economic powerhouses as much as religious institutions. Priests oversee food storage, agriculture, workshops, and trade networks. Meanwhile, you oversee one basket and already feel tired. Inside the shaded courtyard, painted walls depict scenes of pharaohs presenting gifts to gods. The colours remain surprisingly vivid, deep reds, blues, golds, and greens glowing softly in torchlight. Egyptian art follows strict symbolic traditions. Important figures appear larger. Men are often painted darker than women due to outdoor labour. Bodies twist into those familiar profile poses where apparently everyone owns 2 left feet. A young temple worker whispers nervously that one of the sacred cats disappeared yesterday, and priests are furious. Sacred temple animals hold immense religious importance. Some are treated almost like living vessels of divine presence. You imagine trying to explain to future generations that, somewhere in ancient Egypt, priests once organised an emergency search party for a missing holy cat. Civilization truly peaks in strange ways. By midday, incense smoke hangs thick through temple halls, while chants echo against stone walls. The atmosphere feels cool, shadowed, and strangely calm compared to the blazing fields outside. For a moment, standing beneath towering painted columns while prayers rise into the air, you almost believe the gods genuinely watch over Egypt. Then a mosquito bites your ankle. Reality returns immediately. You leave the temple carrying leftover bread distributed after offerings. The Nile glimmers nearby beneath the hot afternoon sun, while villagers continue their endless routines beside the sacred river. Gods fill the skies. Spirits guard the doorways. Priests maintain cosmic order, and ordinary peasants still need to finish carrying water before sunset. The first time you become a parent in ancient Egypt, nobody hands you a helpful instruction scroll titled, "So your child survived birth. Now what?" Instead, everyone simply nods at you with the exhausted expression of people who understand life is about to become dramatically more complicated. Your home already feels crowded before the baby arrives. Now it somehow contains even more noise, more laundry, more anxiety, and significantly less sleep. The child sleeps beside the family on woven mats wrapped in linen cloth, while relatives offer constant advice ranging from useful wisdom to absolute nonsense involving amulets and onions. Mostly onions again. Children matter enormously in Egypt. Families rely on them for future labour, support in old age, and continuation of household traditions. A large family can mean more workers in the fields, more help carrying water, more hands grinding grain. It also means more mouths demanding bread during poor harvests. Life balances constantly between hope and fear. Your wife spends long days managing household work that never truly ends, grinding grain, brewing beer, cooking, weaving linen, carrying water, caring for children, feeding animals, organising storage jars. Historians increasingly emphasise how much peasant women contribute economically to Egyptian society. Without their labour, entire households collapse almost immediately. Ancient records even suggest Egyptian women enjoy somewhat greater legal rights than women in many neighbouring civilizations. Women can own property, inherit goods, initiate divorce in some periods, and conduct business agreements. Which sounds progressive until you remember everyone still works unbelievably hard all the time. The baby cries loudly before sunrise. Naturally. You stumble awake while half asleep relatives mutter complaints from nearby mats. The room feels warm and smells faintly of smoke, milk, and stale beer. Outside, dawn birds already shriek beside the river. Parenthood in ancient Egypt, much like today, apparently begins with chronic exhaustion. Still, moments of tenderness appear unexpectedly. You watch tiny fingers grip your hand. You hear older siblings laughing while entertaining the child with carved wooden toys. You feel pride when the baby survives dangerous early illnesses. because survival is never guaranteed here. Infant mortality in the ancient world remains frighteningly high. Disease, malnutrition, infections, and childbirth complications take many lives. Families often have several children partly because experience teaches them not all will reach adulthood. Ancient cemeteries reveal heartbreaking numbers of child burials, which means every fever becomes terrifying, every cough draws worried attention, every recovery feels miraculous. Religion surrounds childbirth heavily. Women pray to protective deities like Taweret and Bez during pregnancy and labour. Amulets hang near sleeping spaces. Magical spells are recited during difficult births. Some women even use carved birth bricks to squat during labour while invoking divine protection. Historians still argue how much practical medical knowledge existed among midwives versus how much relied mainly on ritual and superstition. Probably, like most ancient medicine, the two remain tangled together constantly. One older woman in the village insists rubbing honey on wounds prevents infection. Oddly enough, modern science later discovers honey actually has antibacterial properties. The same woman also believes evil spirits can enter through improperly arranged sandals. Ancient wisdom contains range. As children grow older, they quickly become part of household labour. Little boys help in fields, fish beside canals and care for animals. Girls assist with grinding grain, weaving, cooking and childcare. Childhood exists, but not in the modern protected sense. Everyone contributes early because survival requires it. You watch older children racing barefoot through dusty village paths, chasing each other with reeds, while adults work nearby. They laugh constantly despite the hard conditions around them. Human beings remain remarkably stubborn about finding joy. A young boy proudly shows you a toy boat carved from wood scraps. Another child wears a tiny protective amulet around her neck shaped like the Eye of Horus. Nearby, a grandmother tells stories beneath the shade of a date palm while mending linen clothing. Oral storytelling matters deeply in societies where literacy remains limited. Tales about gods, spirits, heroic kings, and foolish neighbours pass through generations by memory alone. And naturally every village also has at least one child completely determined to climb somewhere dangerous. One afternoon, your son wanders far too close to the canal chasing frogs. You grab him immediately because canals are dangerous enough without curious children involved. Fast currents, deep mud, snakes, parasites, and crocodiles all wait patiently beside the water. Ancient Egyptian parents probably spend half their lives yelling warnings near rivers. Do not touch that. Do not swim there. Please stop provoking the sacred goose. Family meals become louder now. Children argue over bread portions while adults discuss harvests, taxes, and village gossip. Someone always cries. Someone always spills something. The house somehow grows hotter and noisier every year, yet evenings also feel fuller. You sit outside after sunset holding your youngest child, while warm wind moves through the reeds beside the Nile. Frogs croak endlessly. Nearby families gather beneath oil lamps sharing beer and conversation after long work days. For a few moments, life almost feels gentle. Then the baby vomits directly onto your linen wrap. Parenthood restores humility immediately. As children reach adolescence, their futures become clearer. Most sons inherit agricultural work. Most daughters marry into neighbouring households. Marriage in peasant communities often revolves around practical survival more than romance, though affection certainly exists too. Couples work together constantly, argue together constantly, age visibly together beneath the Egyptian sun. A local marriage celebration interrupts village routine one evening. Musicians play drums and flutes while guests dance beneath torchlight. Beer flows generously. Someone burns incense. Someone else falls into a storage jar after drinking too much fermented barley. Honestly, the gods probably expected this by now. Marriage contracts sometimes include agreements about property and responsibilities. Egyptian women may retain rights over personal belongings brought into marriage. Compared to several other ancient societies, Egyptian marriage customs appear relatively flexible and practical. Though practical does not mean easy. A poor flood season can strain entire families. Food shortages increase tension quickly. Illness spreads through crowded homes. Some children never survive long enough to become adults. And still, families continue building lives beside the Nile generation after generation. Because what else can people do? The river floods, the crops grow, children are born, parents worry endlessly. Tonight your family sleeps together beneath the warm Egyptian sky, while insects hum beyond the mud brick walls. Your youngest child curls beside you, breathing softly in sleep. Tomorrow will bring more labour, more heat, more uncertainty. But for now, in this small crowded house beside the Nile, surrounded by laughter, arguments and sleeping children, your world feels complete enough to keep going. By the time festival season arrives, the entire village feels different. People still wake before sunrise. The grain still needs grinding. The goats still behave like tiny criminals. But beneath the routine hum of daily labour, excitement spreads quietly through the community like the smell of fresh bread drifting across warm air. Because for once, there might actually be something more interesting than work. Ancient Egyptian festivals are loud, crowded, deeply religious, and powered almost entirely by beer. Honestly, humanity reaches certain cultural conclusions very early and never changes them again. You wake before dawn to the sound of neighbours already preparing for the celebration. Women braid hair carefully while children race between houses too excited to remain still. Someone nearby beats dust from linen clothing with unnecessary enthusiasm. Even the village dogs seem confused by the unusual energy. The festival honours a local deity connected to the Nile flood, though honestly most people also seem enthusiastic about the parts involving music and free food. Temple festivals in Egypt can last several days depending on the region and importance of the god involved. During major celebrations, sacred statues leave temple sanctuaries and travel through towns carried on ceremonial boats or platforms. Crowds gather to sing, dance, pray, and request blessings, and drink, very enthusiastically. You walk toward the temple road beside streams of villagers dressed in their cleanest linen. Cleanest remains a relative term because dust exists everywhere in Egypt, but people still make the effort. Some wear jewellery made from beads or shells, others carry flowers, offerings, or small clay lamps. The air smells wonderful compared to ordinary work days. Fresh bread, incense, roasted fish, sweet cakes flavoured with dates and honey, and approximately 11,000 people sweating together beneath the sun. Musicians stand near the temple entrance playing drums, flutes, sistra rattles and stringed instruments while crowds clap rhythmically. Children dance in circles through the dust. Vendors shout over each other selling food, beer, woven goods, sandals, charms and tiny carved amulets. For peasants, festivals provide rare breaks from relentless labour. Work never fully disappears, of course, but celebrations create moments where ordinary people can relax, socialise, and briefly forget the terrifying annual relationship between taxes and grain storage. You stop near a food stall where onions roast beside fish wrapped in leaves. Nearby, a brewer pours thick beer into clay cups while arguing loudly with a customer about whether insects floating in the drink count as extra flavour. Ancient quality control remains flexible. A storyteller gathers children beneath a shaded awning and begins reciting myths about Osiris, Isis and Horus. Egyptian mythology surrounds everyday life so completely that even small children know the major stories. Osiris is murdered and restored. Isis searches faithfully for her husband. Horus battles chaos and claims divine kingship. The gods, much like humans, apparently spend significant time involved in dramatic family arguments. Temple doors open slowly around midday. The crowd surges forward instantly. Priests emerge carrying a sacred shrine draped in cloth and gold decorations. Incense smoke curls through the hot air while chants echo across the square. People kneel, cheer, cry, or lift hands toward the passing image of the god hidden within the shrine. For many ordinary Egyptians, this may be the closest direct contact they ever experience with a temple deity. The atmosphere changes immediately. Even noisy children suddenly fall quiet. You feel it too, that strange mixture of awe, fear, excitement, and communal emotion spreading through the crowd. Religion here is not distant philosophy. It is physical, immediate, woven into the rhythm of survival itself. Historians still argue whether common Egyptians genuinely believed gods physically inhabited temple statues during rituals, or whether symbolic understanding varied among regions and social classes. But standing in this crowd, surrounded by incense, music and chanting, it becomes easy to understand why people feel the divine close around them. Then somebody accidentally drops a beer jar directly onto your foot. Spiritual transcendence has limits. The procession moves slowly through the village, while musicians continue pounding rhythms beneath the blazing sun. Women ululate loudly from rooftops. Men carry offerings beside the shrine. Priests swing censers, releasing sweet clouds of incense over the crowd. A drunken fisherman nearby loudly claims he once saw Sobek the crocodile god personally bless his boat. Another man replies that Sobek probably just wanted his fish. The argument lasts 20 minutes. Festivals also become perfect opportunities for gossip. Villagers exchange rumours about taxes, harvests, marriages, temple politics and local officials. One woman whispers that a regional governor secretly imported exotic wine from distant lands. Another claims priests discovered a sacred ibis behaving strangely before dawn, which apparently means something ominous. Nobody agrees what exactly. A group of dancers performs near the temple square wearing bright beadwork while musicians play faster rhythms. Professional entertainers exist in Egypt, especially during festivals and elite banquets. Acrobats, singers, dancers and musicians travel between settlements or serve temples directly. You attempt dancing briefly after several cups of beer. This proves unwise. Ancient Egyptian beer is usually weaker than many modern versions, but consuming large quantities beneath desert heat still creates consequences. One unfortunate villager falls asleep beside a wall, clutching half a loaf of bread like sacred treasure. Children continue racing through the crowds, carrying little clay toys and sweet cakes sticky with honey. Somewhere nearby, two men argue passionately over donkey prices while a flute player ignores them completely. The festival stretches into evening as torches begin flickering across the village. The Nile reflects firelight and stars beneath the warm night air. Music softens slightly now while families gather in groups, eating, drinking, and talking long after sunset. For one rare night, labour pauses enough for people simply to exist together. No hauling stone, no measuring grain, no crouching in muddy fields beneath the brutal afternoon sun. Just laughter, stories, music, and the comforting feeling of community beside the river. You sit near the water's edge listening to distant drums echo across the dark floodplain. Fireflies flicker among reeds while boats drift slowly along the Nile under moonlight. Tomorrow the work returns. It always returns. But tonight ancient Egypt feels alive in a different way, not as a kingdom of monuments and kings, but as millions of ordinary people sharing songs, food, rumours and beer beneath the stars. And honestly, after enough festival beer, even the crocodiles probably start looking surprisingly friendly. The problem with living beside the Nile is that absolutely everything wants to bite you. Not immediately, of course. Ancient Egypt is beautiful in many ways. Golden sunlight across river water, palm trees swaying in warm wind, fertile black soil stretching beside green reeds. Very peaceful from a distance. Then suddenly a mosquito lands on your neck carrying approximately 17 different unpleasant possibilities. You slap it instinctively while standing ankle-deep near an irrigation canal at sunrise. Around you, workers move through the fields, gathering water and checking embankments after the last small flood surge. Frogs croak loudly from the reeds while insects rise in clouds thick enough to qualify as weather. A fisherman nearby casually mentions seeing crocodile tracks along the muddy bank before dawn. Excellent. Wonderful start to the morning. Crocodiles remain one of the Nile's most terrifying dangers. Ancient Egyptians both fear and respect them intensely. The god Sobek, associated with crocodiles, represents strength, fertility, and the dangerous power of the river itself. In some regions, priests even keep sacred crocodiles adorned with jewellery inside temple pools. Meanwhile, ordinary peasants react to crocodiles the same way modern people react to chainsaws drifting silently toward them in dark water. You carry 2 heavy jars toward the canal, carefully watching the surface. Nile crocodiles can grow enormous, and unlike many predators, they possess the deeply unsettling habit of appearing where you least expect them. A child nearby points excitedly toward a movement in the reeds. Every adult immediately becomes alert. Fortunately, it turns out to be only a turtle. Nobody relaxes fully, though. Life beside the river trains constant caution into people from childhood onward. Parents shout warnings near water. Fishermen travel carefully in groups. farmers avoid certain riverbanks at dusk, and still accidents happen. Hippos are equally dangerous, though ancient art rarely captures the full emotional horror of meeting an angry hippo unexpectedly. Farmers fear them because they destroy crops and attack boats with astonishing aggression. Historians believe hippos may have caused more deaths in ancient Egypt than many predators combined. Yet Egyptians also worship Taweret, the protective hippopotamus goddess of childbirth. Ancient religion continues making emotionally complicated choices. You finish filling the water jars and begin the exhausting walk back toward the village. The sun climbs steadily higher, while dragonflies skim across the canals. Somewhere nearby, someone screams briefly. Snake. Workers freeze instantly. A small cobra slides between stones beside an irrigation ditch before disappearing into tall grass. Everyone watches carefully for another moment before returning nervously to work. Egypt contains several venomous snakes, and snake bites are terrifyingly serious in the ancient world. Medical texts include remedies for bites involving herbs, incantations, oils, and prayers to protective gods. Some treatments probably help. Others sound suspiciously like someone desperately improvising around a basket of random ingredients. One remedy reportedly recommends applying onions and beer foam to wounds. To be fair, onions appear to solve nearly every problem in ancient Egypt except taxes. Back in the village, an elderly healer examines a farmer's infected hand beneath the shade of a palm roof. The cut likely came from agricultural work days earlier. Now the skin looks swollen and angry. Infections spread dangerously fast without modern medicine. Ancient Egyptian healers occupy a strange middle ground between practical physicians and ritual specialists. Some know effective treatments for wounds and broken bones. Surgical tools have even been discovered in medical contexts. Egyptian doctors can stitch cuts, set fractures, and identify symptoms with surprising accuracy. Then, immediately afterward, someone recommends chanting protective spells over goose fat. Historians still argue how advanced Egyptian medicine truly was compared to other ancient societies. Some scholars praise their anatomical observations and practical remedies. Others caution that magical thinking remains deeply intertwined with treatment methods. Either way, if you develop a serious illness, things become worrying quickly. The healer cleans the wound using honey and linen bandages. Oddly enough, honey genuinely helps prevent infection due to its antibacterial properties. Ancient Egyptians stumble onto several surprisingly useful remedies through observation and experience. They also continue using crocodile dung in medical treatments, which feels like the universe balancing itself out. As afternoon heat settles across the village, another danger emerges: disease carried by insects and dirty water. Parasites thrive near canals and floodwaters. Archaeologists studying mummies and skeletal remains have found evidence of diseases including malaria, schistosomiasis, and severe dental infections. Even your teeth are in danger constantly. Grinding grain with stone tools leaves tiny grit particles in flour, slowly wearing teeth down over years. Many ancient Egyptians suffer painful dental damage by adulthood. Imagine enduring endless field labour while also developing toothache severe enough to make thinking difficult. Now imagine the medical treatment options available afterward. One labourer in your village swears by a remedy involving crushed herbs and mouldy bread. Another insists prayers to Sekhmet, goddess associated with plague and healing, work better than medicine. The debate grows surprisingly heated. Nearby, children chase locusts through the dust, while adults nervously inspect crops for signs of infestation. Locust swarms can devastate harvests frighteningly fast. Farmers constantly monitor weather patterns and field conditions, because survival depends on reading nature carefully. You notice protective charms hanging above several doorways now. People become especially superstitious during periods of illness or poor harvests. Amulets shaped like scarabs, eyes, or tiny deities appear everywhere. A woman nearby burns incense while whispering prayers over her feverish child. Smoke drifts softly through the evening air as neighbours gather offering advice, herbs, or food. Moments like this remind you how vulnerable ancient life truly feels. One infection, one bad flood, one snake bite, one failed harvest. Everything balances on uncertainty, and still people continue farming, marrying, celebrating festivals, and raising children beside the Nile year after year. As sunset approaches, fishermen return carrying catches wrapped in nets. They inspect the riverbanks carefully before unloading boats, because crocodiles sometimes linger near villages after dark. A young fisherman proudly claims he fought off a crocodile using only an oar and personal courage. Judging by everyone else's expressions, the crocodile was probably 6 inches long. The evening cools slightly. Families gather outside homes while healers continue visiting the sick by lamplight. Somewhere farther downriver, temple priests conduct rituals asking the gods for protection from disease and disaster. The Nile glimmers peacefully beneath the fading sky, beautiful, fertile, sacred, and filled with enough hazards to make every ordinary trip for water feel like a mild adventure story. You sit quietly outside your home, rubbing sore muscles, while mosquitoes circle hopefully around your ankles. Tomorrow morning, before sunrise, you will return to the fields again, assuming, of course, nothing poisonous reaches you first. If you vanished for an entire day from your household in ancient Egypt, everything would begin falling apart before sunset. Not because you are uniquely important, because absolutely everyone in the house is already operating at maximum exhaustion, and no one works harder than the women. You notice this more clearly as the years pass. At sunrise, while many men head toward fields, canals, or labour projects, the women in the village are already halfway through a list of tasks long enough to frighten professional military planners. Grinding grain, brewing beer, baking bread, weaving linen, fetching water, repairing clothing, caring for children, managing storage jars, feeding animals, cleaning, bartering, preparing offerings, and somehow still finding time to argue with neighbours about missing chickens. Ancient Egyptian women, especially in peasant households, form the hidden framework holding daily life together. Historians increasingly emphasise that without their labour, agricultural communities simply could not function. You wake before dawn to the familiar sound of grinding stones scraping rhythmically in the darkness. Your wife is already awake, kneeling beside the querned stone, turning grain into flour, while smoke from the hearth curls slowly upward. The movement looks exhausting because it is exhausting. Years of repetitive grinding often damage shoulders, knees, and backs. Archaeologists examining skeletons from ancient Egypt sometimes identify stress injuries linked specifically to this kind of labour. Entire lives leave marks on the body. Nearby, a baby sleeps wrapped in linen while an older child carries kindling into the room, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Outside, someone's goat has escaped again and is currently eating part of a vegetable garden with complete emotional confidence. Village life never truly becomes quiet. Your wife pauses briefly to wipe sweat from her forehead, even though sunrise has barely begun. The heat arrives early in Egypt, especially during summer months when the air inside mud brick homes feels thick and unmoving. Still, the work continues. Bread dough must be prepared before the day grows too hot. Beer must ferment properly. Linen must be woven before supplies run short. Egyptian linen production alone requires enormous effort. Flax fibres are soaked, beaten, spun into thread, and woven carefully into cloth by hand. Wealthy Egyptians wear soft, fine linen, almost transparent in quality. Peasants wear rougher fabric that scratches constantly and absorbs approximately half the Nile during summer. You step outside carrying water jars while village women gather near the canal, exchanging gossip faster than professional intelligence networks. News spreads quickly here. Who argued with temple officials? Whose daughter may be getting married? Which family lost a goat? Which fisherman claims he saw a ghost near the reeds after drinking enough beer to legally qualify as a floating brewery? A woman nearby laughs loudly while balancing a water jar on her head with impossible grace. You try carrying one the same way once and nearly concuss yourself against a wall. Skill matters. Ancient Egyptian women also participate in local trade more than many people expect. Some sell food, cloth, perfume oils, or handmade goods at markets. Legal documents show women owning property, inheriting wealth, and entering contracts in certain periods. Historians still argue whether these legal rights translated into broad everyday autonomy for most peasant women, or remained limited mainly to wealthier classes. Real life likely varied enormously depending on region, wealth, and family structure. What remains undeniable is the workload. At midday, the village smells of bread ovens and hot dust. while women move between homes carrying baskets, babies, tools, and endless responsibilities. Children follow behind like small, emotionally unstable ducklings. One elderly grandmother supervises several grandchildren while weaving linen with practiced speed. Another woman brews beer in clay jars beside the house, stirring the mixture while shouting at boys trying to steal dates from a basket nearby. Beer brewing itself becomes serious business. Egyptian beer provides calories, hydration, and nutrition for much of the population. Women often oversee household brewing, meaning civilization continues functioning largely because someone remembers not to ruin the fermentation process. No pressure there. A neighbour's daughter prepares for marriage this week, and the entire village seems involved somehow. Relatives bring gifts of linen, pottery, baskets, and food, while older women offer advice ranging from practical wisdom to terrifyingly specific opinions about stubborn husbands. Marriage in peasant communities usually revolves around partnership and survival rather than elaborate ceremony. Couples build households together, share labour, and raise children within tightly connected village networks. Romance exists, certainly. Egyptian love poetry survives describing affection, longing and admiration with surprising tenderness. But so does arguing over missing grain storage lids. You help repair part of the roof during the afternoon while listening to women nearby discussing temple festivals and childbirth remedies. One insists a certain protective amulet guaranteed all 6 of her children survived infancy. Another replies that the amulet clearly stopped working after the 4th child learned to climb storage shelves. Even in hard conditions, humour survives everywhere. Children gather around their mothers constantly. Little girls begin learning household skills early, while boys drift between domestic tasks and outdoor labour. Families function collectively because individual survival alone is nearly impossible. A sudden argument erupts near the well. Someone accused someone else of stealing onions. Again. Honestly, onions may secretly hold ancient Egyptian society together more than religion. As evening approaches, women continue working long after many men finish field labour. Bread still needs baking. Water still needs carrying. Children still need feeding and calming before sleep. The work simply shifts form rather than ending. Your wife finally sits outside beneath the fading sunset, holding a cup of beer, while warm wind moves through the reeds. For a few quiet moments the village slows. Torches flicker softly. Frogs croak beside the Nile. Children fall asleep one by one against tired parents. You watch the women around the village talking quietly beneath the darkening sky, still mending clothing or preparing tomorrow's supplies even now. No statues will honour them. No giant monuments preserve their names. Yet every household, every harvest, every generation depends on their labour more than official history usually admits. Ancient Egypt may belong to pharaohs in carved stone, but ordinary life belongs to the women keeping everyone alive between sunrise and exhaustion. The letter arrives folded inside official linen and carried by a man who looks far too confident for someone approaching exhausted farmers during harvest season. Nobody likes official messengers. Official messengers never arrive saying things like, "Good news everyone, you may now relax permanently." Instead, they bring taxes, labour demands, census counts, or military orders. Today, unfortunately, it is military orders. You stand beside other villagers near the edge of the fields, while the local administrator reads aloud from a papyrus scroll in the full dramatic tone of a man enjoying entirely too much authority. Egypt requires additional soldiers for campaigns farther south, he announces. Young men are expected to report for service after the next flood season. A silence settles across the crowd. Nobody volunteers enthusiastically. Because while Egypt's armies can bring prestige, payment, and opportunities for loot, military life also includes arrows, disease, desert marches, and the deeply inconvenient possibility of dying somewhere far from the Nile beside people whose language you do not even understand. You glance toward your family instinctively. Your wife looks worried already. Ancient Egypt maintains armies throughout much of its history, especially during periods of expansion under rulers like Thutmose III or Rameses II. Campaigns push into Nubia, Canaan, Syria, and surrounding regions seeking resources, tribute, territory, and political dominance. And every grand imperial ambition eventually reaches down into villages like yours asking for manpower. At first, you hope your age might spare you. Then the official points directly at your section of the crowd. Wonderful. Training begins weeks later beneath brutal heat outside a regional garrison town. You arrive carrying basic supplies, while dozens of other peasants gather nervously nearby. Some look excited. Most look deeply unconvinced by the entire experience. An older veteran limps past, muttering that military life mostly involves marching until your feet forget joy entirely. Very inspiring introduction. Egyptian soldiers use spears, shields, axes, bows, and later increasingly sophisticated weapons influenced by foreign enemies. Chariots become especially important during the New Kingdom period, though ordinary infantrymen like you mostly focus on staying alive long enough to complain about rations afterward. Training is exhausting. Marching drills, weapon practice, formation exercises, more marching. Apparently ancient military strategy relies heavily on the theory that tired people can always become more tired. You practice with a spear beneath the afternoon sun, while instructors shout corrections constantly. Nearby recruits struggle with shield formations in clouds of dust thick enough to taste. One unfortunate man drops his spear directly into a canal. Another somehow injures himself standing still. Human history remains reassuringly consistent. Still, military service offers possibilities unavailable in village life. Successful soldiers may receive rewards, land, food shares, or social advancement. Some commoners rise surprisingly high through military careers. Foreign campaigns also expose Egyptians to goods, ideas, and cultures from distant regions. Though personally you would settle for slightly better sandals. At night, recruits gather around campfires sharing rumours about the coming campaign. Some claim Nubian archers can hit birds in flight from impossible distances. Others insist foreign cities contain markets overflowing with silver, wine, and strange animals. One man swears he heard of a land where it rains constantly from the sky. Nobody believes him because that sounds medically unreasonable. Historians still argue whether ordinary Egyptian soldiers felt patriotic loyalty toward the pharaoh, or mainly viewed service as economic obligation and survival. Probably both again. National identity in ancient societies works differently than modern concepts, but Egypt's long stability and powerful symbolism likely create genuine cultural pride. You certainly understand the importance of protecting the Nile homeland. You would simply prefer someone else perform the protecting. Weeks later, the army begins moving south along the river. Boats carry supplies while infantry marches beside the Nile beneath blazing sunlight. Dust coats everything. Armour rubs skin raw. Water remains precious despite travelling beside the world's most famous river, because not all river water is safe to drink directly. Military camps smell terrible. Sweat, leather, smoke, wet linen, too many men sleeping too close together. Honestly, it resembles a festival after all the music dies. Officers inspect troops carefully while scribes record provisions and personnel with typical Egyptian bureaucratic enthusiasm. Nothing escapes documentation here. Grain rations, equipment counts, injuries, absences. Somewhere a scribe is always writing things down while you suffer nearby. You encounter professional soldiers during the march who seem almost relaxed about military life. Some wear better equipment earned through experience. Others carry scars with unsettling casualness. One veteran points toward the desert horizon and explains how quickly men can disappear during sandstorms if formations break apart. You sleep poorly afterward. The farther south the campaign travels, the stranger the landscape feels. Villages change. Languages sound unfamiliar. New gods appear painted on temple walls. Egypt's empire stretches across diverse peoples connected through trade, warfare and political control, and peasants like you help maintain it whether you plan to or not. One evening, scouts report hostile raiders nearby. The camp grows tense immediately. Fires burn lower. Officers move between units whispering instructions. You lie awake, gripping your spear while insects buzz around the camp, and distant river sounds echo through darkness. This suddenly feels very real. Fortunately, the expected attack never comes. By morning, tension eases slightly, though nobody fully relaxes. Ancient warfare often involves long periods of waiting interrupted by terrifying bursts of violence. A nearby recruit quietly admits he misses farming. You stare at him for a moment. Farming. The endless mud. The crushing labour. The taxes. The mosquitoes. and somehow, compared to military life, it now sounds comforting. That realization alone feels deeply offensive. Eventually the campaign ends with tribute secured from local rulers and enough official speeches praising the pharaoh to emotionally exhaust an entire generation. The army begins returning north toward Egypt, carrying supplies, prisoners, livestock, and stories exaggerated further with every retelling. By the time you finally glimpse the familiar Nile floodplains near home, relief washes through you stronger than any religious festival. Your village appears almost unchanged. Children run beside the paths, women carry water jars, fields stretch green beside the river. Life continues, because empires may expand and kings may wage glorious campaigns carved into temple walls, but ordinary people still wake before sunrise needing bread, water, and working crops. You step back onto familiar muddy ground, feeling older somehow. The Nile breeze smells the same, the village sounds the same, and tomorrow morning, after surviving war itself, you will probably still get assigned another impossible amount of agricultural labour before breakfast. At some point, without warning, your body stops recovering properly. You notice it first one morning while standing from your sleeping mat. Normally the stiffness fades after a few stretches and several complaints directed toward the sunrise. This time the ache remains, your knees protest, your back crackles ominously. One shoulder feels permanently attached at the wrong angle. Congratulations, you are now old by ancient Egyptian peasant standards. Not necessarily elderly in modern terms, of course, but decades of hauling water, grinding grain, cutting crops, carrying stone, surviving floods, marching in military campaigns, and sleeping on reed mats have transformed your skeleton into something resembling a damaged farming tool. You step outside slowly into the pale dawn light, while younger workers already move toward the fields carrying hoes over their shoulders. Their pace irritates you immediately, too energetic, suspicious behaviour. The Nile still glimmers beautifully beneath sunrise mist. Palm trees still sway gently beside irrigation canals. Birds still scream like tiny angry officials announcing another day of labour. Some things never change, but you have. Your hands are rough and thick with old scars now. Fingernails cracked from years of work. The skin across your neck and arms darkened by endless Egyptian sunlight. Many older peasants develop stooped postures from agricultural labour. Archaeologists studying ancient skeletons often find severe arthritis, spinal damage, and worn joints among workers. Ancient Egypt is visually magnificent and physically catastrophic. You walk carefully toward the fields carrying lighter tools these days because younger relatives handle most of the heavy lifting now. Your sons work beside the canals where you once stood. Your daughters manage households of their own nearby. Grandchildren race through the village with the exact same dangerous enthusiasm their parents once displayed. And somehow the children still climb things they absolutely should not climb. One grandson proudly presents a frog he captured near the reeds. Another nearly falls into a storage jar moments later. Civilization survives entirely through exhausted adults intervening repeatedly. The younger workers ask for advice now. You explain flood timing, irrigation patterns, soil conditions, and which sections of canal banks collapse first after heavy inundations. Experience matters enormously in farming communities where survival depends on understanding the river's moods. The Nile still controls everything: good flood, good harvest, weak flood, bad harvest, too much flood. Everyone panics professionally. Historians still argue whether elderly peasants in ancient Egypt received strong family support, or whether old age became precarious once physical labour grew difficult. Probably both, depending on family size and harvest success. Multi-generational households certainly help. Older people contribute knowledge, childcare, religious guidance, and lighter domestic work. But food shortages strain compassion quickly. You sit beneath a date palm during midday heat, while younger workers continue harvesting nearby. The air smells dry and dusty now. Grain rustles in warm wind. Somewhere farther downriver, temple drums echo faintly across the floodplain. A grandson asks whether you really helped haul stones for royal monuments years ago. You nod slowly. He stares at you like you personally constructed the pyramids one-handed while wrestling crocodiles. you decide not to correct him. Old age grants certain storytelling privileges. Nearby, other older villagers gather in the shade discussing politics, taxes, weather, and increasingly specific medical complaints. One man insists his knees can predict flood levels more accurately than priests. Another claims onions cured his back pain. A third loudly accuses both of being idiots while applying mud to his swollen ankle. Ancient retirement communities apparently function exactly as expected. Still, aging brings quieter moments too. You notice sunsets more often now, the way evening light turns the Nile bronze, the smell of baking bread drifting between houses, children laughing beside canals while frogs croak in the reeds. For most of your life, exhaustion rushed everything forward. Work dominated every season. Now time stretches differently, not always pleasantly. Friends disappear gradually. A fever takes one neighbour during flood season. Another dies from an infected wound after a farming accident. Funeral processions move through the village with uncomfortable regularity. Death never feels distant in Egypt. Yet Egyptians also spend enormous energy preparing for it. You help attend a local burial outside the village cemetery where simple graves line the desert edge. Wealthy Egyptians build elaborate tombs filled with treasures and painted walls. Peasants usually receive modest burials with pottery, tools, food offerings and protective amulets if families can afford them. Still, even poor families try to honour the dead properly, because the afterlife matters deeply. The soul, or rather the several spiritual aspects Egyptians believe humans possess, requires rituals, remembrance, and safe passage after death. Priests speak prayers while relatives leave bread and beer offerings near graves. One elderly woman whispers that if descendants stop bringing offerings, the dead become restless. Given your family's tendency to forget absolutely everything except gossip, this concerns you slightly. Your eyesight weakens gradually too. Fine details blur in strong sunlight. Reading remains impossible for you anyway, but now even threading fishing nets becomes frustrating. A healer recommends herbal treatments. Another suggests prayers to Thoth. Someone else once again recommends onions. Honestly, ancient Egypt may secretly worship onions more faithfully than half. The official gods. One evening after harvest, your family gathers outside beneath warm night air, while grandchildren sleep nearby wrapped in linen cloth. Oil lamps flicker softly against mud brick walls. The Nile reflects moonlight beyond the reeds. You watch your children discussing flood levels and grain storage exactly the way your parents once did. Same worries, same routines, same river, generation after generation. For all the power of pharaohs and armies and temples, ordinary life changes slowly here. Empires rise, rulers die, monuments weather beneath desert wind, yet peasants still wake before sunrise to grind grain and carry water beside the Nile. You feel strangely proud of surviving this long. Not triumphant exactly, just stubborn. Your body aches constantly now. Several teeth are gone, your hands shake slightly in cold mornings, but you endured floods, droughts, taxes, disease, construction labour, military service, and enough mosquitoes to darken the sun. That counts for something. The night grows quieter around the village. Frogs continue singing beside the river while warm wind rustles through palm leaves overhead. Tomorrow the younger generation will return to the fields again before dawn, and you, sitting beneath the Egyptian stars with tired bones and fading strength, finally understand something strange. The monuments may belong to kings, but Egypt itself has always belonged to the people who kept waking up anyway. The older you become, the more often people talk about death like it is simply another season approaching along the Nile, not in a dramatic way. Nobody stands around whispering ominously while thunder crashes overhead. Ancient Egypt is much too practical for that. Instead, conversations about death happen while baking bread, repairing fishing nets, or arguing over grain storage lids. Someone mentions a cousin needing burial linen. Someone else discusses tomb offerings between complaints about taxes. A grandmother reminds children to leave proper food for ancestors, while simultaneously chasing chickens away from the doorway. Death lives beside ordinary life here constantly. And honestly, after surviving this long in ancient Egypt, you understand why people spend so much effort preparing for the afterlife. If existence involves decades of sunburn, mosquitoes, and carrying heavy objects through mud, eternal paradise starts sounding extremely reasonable. You wake before dawn listening to distant morning songs drifting across the village. An older farmer died during the night after weeks of illness. By sunrise, neighbours already move quietly between homes, carrying water jars, linen cloth, bread and beer for the funeral preparations. The body must be handled carefully. Ancient Egyptian beliefs about death are incredibly detailed. The soul is not viewed as one single thing, but several spiritual elements working together. The car requires offerings. The best travels between worlds. The heart preserves memory and morality. Proper rituals help ensure safe passage into the afterlife. Wealthy Egyptians receive elaborate mummification processes involving organ removal, natron salt drying, protective amulets, painted coffins, and tombs filled with treasures. Peasants, unsurprisingly, receive the budget version. Still, even ordinary families do everything possible within their means. Linen wrappings are prepared carefully. Simple grave goods are gathered. Bread, beer, pottery, and small personal objects accompany the dead whenever possible, because eternity apparently requires supplies. You help carry the wrapped body toward the desert cemetery beyond the cultivated land. Egyptians usually bury their dead west of the Nile, because the setting sun symbolizes the journey into death. The western desert becomes associated with the realm of the dead itself. The procession moves slowly through warm morning air, while relatives sing mourning chants. Women scatter dust over their hair. Children watch quietly from nearby rooftops. Funerals are emotional but also strangely organized. There are rituals to complete, prayers to recite, offerings to place. Even grief follows structure in Egypt. A priest meets the procession near the burial ground, carrying incense and sacred oils. He speaks prayers asking Osiris, ruler of the afterlife, to guide the deceased safely beyond death. Osiris matters deeply to ordinary Egyptians because his myth promises rebirth after suffering. If even a murdered god can return from death, perhaps exhausted farmers stand a chance too. Historians still argue how deeply afterlife beliefs reached among poorer Egyptians versus elite theological traditions. But burial customs appear widespread across social classes, suggesting ordinary people genuinely hope for existence beyond death. And honestly, hope becomes valuable in hard lives. You stand beside rows of simple graves marked by stones and modest mud brick structures. Wind moves softly across the desert edge, carrying dry sand over older burials. Somewhere beneath these dunes lie generations of villagers who worked the same fields, carried water from the same river, and worried about the same flood seasons. The continuity feels enormous. The priest performs a simplified version of the opening of the mouth ritual, symbolically restoring the dead person's senses for the afterlife. Wealthier ceremonies involve elaborate tools and chants. Here the ritual is quieter, but still meaningful. Nearby, someone places onions beside the grave. Of course they do. At this point, onions probably possess official diplomatic status between the living and the dead. The body is lowered carefully into the grave wrapped in linen. Family members leave bread, beer jars, amulets, and small possessions nearby. One child quietly adds a carved wooden toy. That nearly breaks everyone emotionally. As the grave is sealed, the mourners speak softly about the dead man's life. Not grand achievements, not royal honours, mostly ordinary things. He repaired canals during difficult floods. He shared grain during a poor harvest. He made terrible jokes during beer festivals. He once fought a goose with surprising determination. This is how ordinary people become remembered. Back in the village afterward, life resumes quickly because survival leaves little time for extended mourning. Grain still needs grinding, animals still need feeding, water still needs carrying from the Nile. Death pauses nothing for long, yet the dead remain present everywhere in Egyptian thought. Families leave offerings at tombs, ancestors appear in dreams, protective amulets guard against restless spirits. Some people even write letters to deceased relatives asking for supernatural help with disputes or illnesses. Imagine being dead peacefully for years only to receive complaints from cousins about property arguments. The afterlife sounds exhausting too. That evening you sit outside your home watching sunsets spread red across the Nile, while younger relatives prepare dinner nearby. The river glows beneath the fading sky exactly as it did during your childhood. The same reeds sway in warm wind. The same frogs sing from canals. The same stars slowly emerge overhead. and now you think more often about your own death. Not fear exactly, more curiosity. Will your family remember the offerings properly? Will the priest speak the right prayers? Will your soul pass safely through the underworld with all its strange gates, guardians, and divine judgments? Egyptian belief says the dead eventually face judgment before Osiris. Your heart is weighed against the feather of Maat, truth and cosmic balance. If the heart proves heavy with wrongdoing, a monstrous creature called Amit devours it completely. Anxiety-inducing concept, honestly. You mentally review your life. Hard work. Some arguments. A few lies about grain measurements, probably. Several regrettable festival decisions involving beer. Hopefully the gods grade generously. Night settles fully across the village now. Oil lamps flicker softly while families gather beneath rooftops and stars. Somewhere beyond the dark fields, desert graves rest quietly beneath drifting sand. You realise something comforting then. For all their fear of death, Egyptians also believe deeply in continuity. The Nile returns every year. The sun rises every morning. Families endure generation after generation. And perhaps, beyond the western horizon where the sun disappears each evening, ordinary peasants finally find rest beneath gentler skies. Something feels different along the Nile now. Not suddenly. Ancient Egypt changes too slowly for suddenness most of the time. The river still floods. Farmers still rise before dawn. Bread still bakes in clay ovens while children still chase dogs through dusty village paths. But beneath the familiar rhythms, small cracks have started appearing. And everyone notices them, even if nobody fully understands what they mean yet. You stand beside the canal at sunrise watching weaker floodwaters creep across the fields. The inundation has become less predictable these past few years. Some elders blame angry gods, others blame poor leadership. A few whisper that Egypt itself is losing balance, that Maat, the sacred order holding the world together, is beginning to fray. Historians still argue whether periods of Egyptian decline were caused mainly by environmental stress, political fragmentation, foreign invasions, economic strain, or combinations of all four. From where you stand ankle-deep in muddy water, however, the explanation feels simpler. The harvests are getting worse, and hungry people become nervous very quickly. Tax collectors still arrive exactly on schedule, naturally. Amazing how efficiently governments function during shortages. You carry grain towards storage buildings while overhearing frustrated conversations spreading through the village. One family lost crops after a damaged canals flooded improperly. Another complains that temple officials demanded full taxes despite poor yields. A fisherman swears river fish are becoming scarcer too. Someone else blames the fishermen. Human beings remain committed to blaming each other during difficult times. Farther north, rumours drift down the Nile alongside merchant boats and travelling officials. Rival nobles argue over power. Foreign raiders threaten border regions. Trade routes shift unpredictably. Certain temples grow wealthier while ordinary villagers struggle more each season. You do not fully understand high politics. You understand empty grain jars perfectly. The village market feels tense now. Fewer luxury goods appear on stalls. Traders bargain harder. Beer portions mysteriously shrink while prices somehow rise anyway, which honestly feels like one of history's cruelest betrayals. A woman near the bread ovens mutters that things were better during her parents' time. Every civilization eventually produces this sentence. Children still play beside the river, though. Life continues stubbornly, even during uncertainty. Young boys race reed boats through irrigation channels, while girls gather flowers near the floodplain. Goats still escape enclosures with supernatural consistency, yet adults watch the horizon more often now. One afternoon, soldiers march through the village wearing unfamiliar equipment influenced by foreign enemies Egypt once defeated easily. Their officers speak urgently with local officials before continuing south. Dust hangs behind them long after they disappear. War feels closer lately. Egypt has survived invasions before, of course. Hyksos rulers once controlled parts of the kingdom centuries earlier. Nubians, Libyans, Assyrians, Persians. Powerful outsiders rise and fall around the Nile repeatedly. But ordinary peasants experience these grand historical shifts mostly through consequences. Higher taxes, military recruitment, disrupted harvests, and rumours. Always rumours. A travelling merchant claims entire cities farther north struggle with unrest. Another insists foreign traders now dominate ports once controlled entirely by Egyptians. Someone whispers that certain temples no longer receive enough offerings to maintain proper rituals. That last rumour frightens people most. Because if rituals fail, perhaps the gods truly are abandoning Egypt. You sit outside your home after sunset listening to older villagers debate the reasons behind recent hardships. One blames corrupt officials, another blames neglected canals. A third insists younger generations simply lack discipline and respect for the gods. Your grandson immediately trips over a goat moments later. The timing feels unfortunate for his argument. Still, traditions endure despite uncertainty. Festivals continue, families marry, priests chant beside temple fires, farmers plant crops whenever the floodwaters allow. Ancient Egypt possesses enormous cultural momentum built across thousands of years. People do not abandon familiar worlds easily. One evening during flood season, you travel farther along the Nile helping relatives repair damaged irrigation walls. Along the journey you pass abandoned homes near fields no longer producing reliable harvests. Cracked mud lines, empty canals. The sight unsettles you deeply. Egypt without strong floods feels unnatural, like the sun forgetting how to rise properly. Nearby, a priest performs offerings beside the river, asking Happy to restore balance to the inundation. Villagers kneel silently nearby while incense smoke drifts across dark water. For a moment, the entire scene feels ancient beyond measure. River, prayer, fear, hope. The same cycle repeated for generations stretching farther back than memory itself. And yet even mighty civilizations eventually change. You realise this gradually while watching younger relatives adopt new tools, new trade habits, even new words borrowed from foreign merchants passing through the region. Egypt absorbs outside influences constantly despite its powerful traditions. The world beyond the Nile keeps moving. Empires rise elsewhere. New armies march. New rulers arrive speaking unfamiliar languages. But here beside the river, ordinary people still wake before dawn, needing bread and water first. That truth survives every dynasty. Years pass quietly now. Your hair has turned completely grey. Your movements slow further. Children who once played beside canals now guide ploughs through the same fields you worked during youth. Some temples remain magnificent. Others crumble slowly beneath wind and neglect. One afternoon, your grandson asks whether Egypt will last forever. You look out across the Nile before answering. The river glows gold beneath the evening sunlight. Farmers move through distant fields while birds circle above the reeds. Somewhere farther away, monuments built centuries earlier still stand against the desert horizon. Forever is difficult to measure for people who spend most days worrying about next season's harvest. So you simply tell him this. Empires change. Kings disappear. Even stone eventually wears away. But as long as people wake before sunrise beside the Nile, carry water through warm morning air, bake bread for their families, and watch the river flood the fields again, some part of Egypt survives. The stars emerge slowly overhead now. The village quiets. The Nile flows onward through darkness exactly as it always has. And beneath those ancient stars, with warm desert wind brushing softly across the reeds, your long life beside the river finally begins to feel very far away, almost dreamlike, fading gently into the endless sound of moving water and distant frogs singing beside the eternal Nile. The night grows softer now, cooler, quieter. The labour of the fields drifts behind you like dust settling after harvest. The noise of festivals fades. The voices of tax collectors, foremen, priests, soldiers, neighbours, and laughing children all blur gently together until they sound like echoes carried downstream beneath moonlight. You no longer need to hurry anywhere. The river moves slowly beside the darkened reeds, silver under the stars. Palm trees sway lazily in the warm night breeze while oil lamps flicker out one by one across the village. Somewhere nearby, a family settles onto their rooftop mats. Someone whispers a prayer to the household gods. A baby sighs softly in sleep, and Egypt keeps breathing. The Nile rises. The Nile falls. Season after season. Generation after generation. The same stars look down over mud-brick homes, quiet temples, empty sandals left beside doorways, and old fields waiting patiently for another flood. The great monuments far away no longer feel heavy or overwhelming now. They simply rest beneath the desert sky, silent and distant, while ordinary lives continue below them. You think about all the mornings you watch the sunrise spread gold across the riverbanks, all the evenings scented with bread smoke and warm reeds, all the laughter drifting through festivals beneath torchlight. Even the hardships feel softened now, worn smooth by time like river stones beneath flowing water. Your tired body grows lighter. The noise of the world drifts farther away. Only the sound of the Nile remains, steady, endless, gentle. And somewhere beyond the western horizon, where the sun disappears each evening into quiet desert light, perhaps the fields are always fertile there, the floodwaters always kind, and no one ever wakes before dawn to pay taxes again.